This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese President Xi Jinping has stressed while speaking with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on his arrival in Moscow that both China and Russia see their relationship as a high priority in their overall diplomacy and policy on external affairs. The two sides also had an in-depth exchange of views on the Ukraine issue. What have been the major outcomes of the meeting between the two leaders? Where will we see the expansion of bilateral cooperation, and what a role China will play in helping resolve the Ukraine crisis? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Andrew Korybko, Moscow-based American political analyst, Zhou Bo, senior fellow at the Center for International Strategy and Security of Tsinghua University, and Professor Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Zhou Bo, I will start with you. What's the visit about? What can we expect out of the summit between the two leaders?
Well, the world actually is focused on how Chinese President Xi Jinping might help with the Ukraine issue. But I want to say that, first of all, this is more about bilateral issues, because ever since the late 1990s, the Chinese and the Russian leadership have jointly decided to mechanize or regularize this kind of visits at the head of states level and also at premier or prime minister level. So that is why we will see the leaders of the two countries visit each other on alternative basis. Last year, it was President Putin who came to China, and this year, naturally, it is President Xi Jinping's turn. So I would say that this visit definitely would be fruitful when they discuss about bilateral issues. And I believe there aren't many serious problems in bilateral issues. And then, of course, the question is about the Ukrainian issue. The Ukrainian issue has nothing to do with China. China was not informed, China was not involved, but I'm sure this issue would be discussed in length.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, you are based in Moscow. Tell us what's the response, from the public as well as from the official level to the visit of Mr. Xi.
Okay, everybody is very happy to have President Xi and his delegation in Moscow. This is occurring at a very important moment in the history of international relations, whereby the global systemic transition of multipolarity has unprecedentedly accelerated over the past year since the last time that President Putin visited President Xi in Beijing. Of course, we had the Ukraine conflict, we had certain U.S. provocations in Taiwan, but we also have the fact that a lot of the world is not going along with Western dominance anymore. Quite surprisingly, in some cases, the vast majority of humanity actually is not sanctioning Russia, is not arming Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So this occurs at a very important time whereby what had previously been known as the unipolar moment for sure no longer exists. Now, having said that, multipolarity is emerging, but it has yet to fully form. And it's here where Russia and China can play the most important roles in this process, because these are two of the strongest, most influential major countries in the world, and their coordinated policies can help accelerate this process even further and help stabilize some of the chaos associated with this transition that was brought about by the U.S. trying to divide and rule Eurasia to delay the decline of its unipolar hegemony. So because of this larger context, people are very excited. They're eager to see what the long-term outcome will be after President Xi leaves and how much closer Russia and China will coordinate on the economy, on global governance, on climate, on regional security issues, and other such issues. So I think there are very high hopes, and people are just very happy to have the Chinese president here in Moscow at this super important time.
Well, Glenn, as Andrew mentioned about this process of transitioning from unipolar to multipolar world, geopolitically, some say this is the most significant summit since the start of the Ukraine crisis. What do you make of it?
Well, I would definitely agree because, as Andrew pointed out, this signifies this final transition from unipolarity to multipolarity. So, and you can see it also by the topics which they are covering. So this is not just a bilateral agreement or bilateral agreements between China and Russia. We also see it's being part of a much wider development, which is diversifying away from this economic system under the US administration, which is, again, focused around hegemony, one that tends to divide the world into either obedient, dependent allies or weakened adversaries. And we see now China, with Russia as a partner, taking the lead in diversifying away from this. So this is, industrial cooperation, developing, new technologies, digitalization of the economy. We see agriculture, energy cooperation. See this. These two countries are part of developing these new transportation corridors, land bridges also by sea. We're seeing new financial instruments coming into place. So new banks, payment systems, and of course China really leading the way now with using local currencies, recent agreements with Saudi Arabia. So the whole world is really changing, and I think that as the world transitions now, it's this Chinese-Russian partnership is really spearheading it. So you can't really you can't overstate how significant this meeting taking place really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, a significant summit, partly because of the nature for it being the heavyweights in the international, I would say, arena. Zhou Bo, of course, often, in particular in the West, I would say the media mischaracterize the relationship between China and Russia as allies, and some others would say, they are driven by the West, or in particular by the U.S., to get closer and closer. How do you characterize the relationship between Beijing and Moscow?
Well, I think the West is particularly allergic to this term, that unlimited friendship. This is very much ridiculous in that, let me just give you an example. If I say I want to have a friendship with you, should I also say that, hang on for a moment, this relationship has to be limited? When you talk about friendship, of course, you just want to develop it. You cannot say that there is a limit on this relationship. But this relationship, in spite of our good wishes to develop it in an unlimited way, is not militarized, because the war actually has proven one thing, that is that the China-Russian relationship is not one of military allies. We're not providing Russia any military support, and if we did, then probably we're already in the dawn of the Third World War. So I think China's contribution to the war are really underappreciated, because China so far has actually made contributions on two things. One is not throwing the wood into the fire, because of what I said. China is not picking sides. Second, China has made it quite clear that no nuclear weapons should be allowed to use in Europe. And that, of course, is in line with China's decades-old nuclear policy on not using nuclear weapons first, on not using nuclear weapons against any nuclear weapon-free countries or regions.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhou Bo, also, China and Russia, they made it public that they are committed to no alliance, no confrontation, and not targeting any third party in developing bilateral ties. There's a sincerity from the Chinese side to develop relations, a model of major power or major country relationship, featuring basically respect and equity. So somehow is frequently being mischaracterized or misunderstood as ally, in particular against the U.S. Or there's a frequent accusation somehow China is providing lethal weapons to Moscow. What's the logic of the Chinese insistence that China is not providing weapons to parties to a conflict?
Well, I think American Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked about how China, according to him, was thinking of providing lethal weapons. I don't know why he would say that, because I believe he was actually gambling on a kind of hypothetical scenarios. If China did provide military assistance, he would say, yes, I was right. And if China didn't provide military support, he would say, yes, I'm also right, because my warning has actually taken some effect. Because let me be honest with you on this. If China does provide military support or assistance, it cannot go unnoticed. It will be discovered. So when Chinese government or Chinese spokesman for Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that we are not doing this, I believe this is an ironclad commitment. We're not going to do this.
Mm-hmm. Well, Glenn, if you look at China-Russia relationship, China has expressed this, sincerity for, all the desire, let's say, for peace and stability, because China prioritizes development. Without peace, without stability, there's, hardly have any development there. But somehow the Chinese position is often being underappreciated, if not misunderstood, in particular in the West. For example, the recent proposals for peace for Ukraine, it was almost dismissed by Washington. What's going on here?
Well, there's always this assumption that China has some hidden agenda, and I think it's because of some of this bloc politics, this zero-sum mentality they have in Washington. Because as we see, when the United States, again, it has a hegemonic policy, it tends to divide countries into allies and adversaries. But what we're actually seeing with China, it seems very, very, very genuine, and it can be traced back to China having economic incentives to get along effectively with everyone. And I think that should have been the lesson from the Middle East as well. That is, China seeks, to get closer with Iran, but they don't want to upset the Saudis or the Israelis, so they work with them as well. And by promoting peace between the different parties, it becomes easier for China to engage deeper economically with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. So peace is in the interest of China, and you see the same in Europe. China has its Belt and Road Initiative, has of course the Russian partnership is prioritized, but they also want to have good relationship with Ukraine. So I think this effort of promoting itself as an honest broker, I think it's real. I haven't seen any evidence why it wouldn't be. So I think that in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, China would like to take a neutral stance. I'm not sure, though, if I agree if China would preserve this if Russia was losing, because I think this is also a war between NATO and Russia. So I think if Russia was losing and NATO was able to crush Russia, then maybe China would perhaps provide weapons, because if Russia falls, China is next. So I think, but again, I think we're far away from that scenario. So at the moment, I see this peace proposal by the Chinese as being, genuine, authentic. And I think the reason why it's being dismissed so quickly from Washington is, as John Kirby, the National Security Council communication director, said, any ceasefire is unacceptable. This is a proxy war as well. They're fighting Russia with Ukrainians. They have no intentions of allowing any ceasefire establish itself. Again, it's been more than a year now. Not a single Western leader has advocated negotiations or compromise or ceasefire. So when China steps forward and proposes this, it's immediately denounced as not being genuine. I think it speaks more of Washington itself and in terms of its objectives in this proxy war.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, as Glenn has said, that in the United States is criticizing the Chinese move even before China made any official statement on the Ukraine, during the visit on the Ukraine issue, basically calling for a political settlement. And then the U.S. said, ceasefire is not accepted. And then what's the option? Prolonged war will be the right choice?
Okay, the way that I see it is that the United States is maliciously mispresenting China's policy paper towards the conflict, which has widely been interpreted as a peace plan and can quite easily function as one if the political will is present. However, that's questionable in the sense when we look at Ukraine's interest, because President Zelensky, he tries to present himself as an independent leader, but he is quite obviously under heavy Western influence to continue indefinitely perpetuating this conflict for the purpose of inflicting a so-called strategic defeat on Russia. However, the military strategic dynamics of the conflict are not trending in his side's favor. And I'd just like to recall a couple facts in support of what I just said. The first is what NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently declared last month. He spoke about a so-called race of logistics, which he also termed a war of attrition with Russia. So you have one country, Russia, that is fighting a proxy war against around 30 other countries. And those 30 other countries have yet to wear down Russia. So this is the first dynamic that is not in Kiev's favor. In fact, it shows how robust and resilient Russia's military-industrial complex, economy, and political stability have been. The second factor is what was recently revealed by the Washington Post. They published a very critical article about the state of Kiev's military affairs the other week. And some of the details were not kind to Kiev's side. Actually, they're quite shocking that the Ukrainian armed forces are so unprepared, underarmed, and undertrained, despite over $100 billion of comprehensive assistance having flooded into their coffers over the past year. And the third point is what Zelensky himself acknowledged in an exclusive interview with CNN. Recently, he said that if the city of Artyomovsk, otherwise known as Bakhmut in Ukrainian, ends up being captured by Russia, perhaps Russia could roll through the rest of the Donbas region. So considering these dynamics at play, there is a possibility that Zelensky might actually reconsider his maximal goals in the conflict, which are, in brief, to restore Kiev's pre-2014 borders, and maybe settle for some type of negotiated settlement, or at the very least a type of ceasefire to avert any further losses. Because as I said, the military strategic dynamics are not trending in his favor. Considering this larger context, China's peace proposal could not have come at a better time for both sides. Russia wants to negotiate with Ukraine, but it wants negotiations to be sincere, and it wants them to be intended towards achieving tangible dividends. However, Kiev has made it illegal for President Zelensky to negotiate with his Russian counterpart, President Putin. However, workarounds could be achieved through their diplomats. It remains to be seen, but the primary variable is this. Can President Zelensky achieve enough or regain enough policy-making independence to make his own autonomous decisions in this conflict, despite heavy Western pressure on him to indefinitely perpetuate this proxy conflict? And if so, how would he move forward? And I believe the direction forward would be to seriously consider what China has put forth in its recent policy paper.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, obviously it seems that Washington, Brussels, they are pinning their hope for the Ukraine crisis on the defeat or complete defeat of Russia, if not destroying this country. How likely is that scenario?
I don't believe that's likely at all, because as I had mentioned in my previous response, you have a coalition of around 30 countries indirectly fighting against Russia in the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine, and they have yet to inflict that major defeat. Also, you have the fact that historically unprecedented, by far, sanctions against Russia have failed to crush its economy and destabilize its internal political cohesion. Quite the contrary, Russia is very politically united, cohesive, and stable, and even the IMF has recently published a report, I believe about a month ago, predicting that the Russian economy will grow by a minuscule percentage, but nevertheless, it's not entering into recession. So that major blow that was supposed to be the coup de grace in the first month or so of this proxy conflict did not achieve the dividends. Now, having said that, in the medium and long terms, yes, there is always a risk of something going wrong from the Russian perspective, but that's precisely why President Putin recently warned the Russian government to not be complacent, to remain focused. So to answer your question in brief, no, that is not going to happen. That scenario is a political fantasy and is only being spewed to justify the enormous amounts of money that have been expended on this proxy conflict in order to placate the Western population so they feel it is towards a so-called greater cause, instead of starting to question whether it's all worth it after it quite clearly failed to achieve its major strategic objective.
Well, Zhou Bo, it seems that if you look at the remarks from their spokesperson, the Kirby, and also Secretary of State Antony Blinken, on the visit by President Xi Jinping, it seems like Washington is, it's deeply worried that China might be successful in creating a ceasefire, if not a peace, between Russia and Ukraine. What's behind this concern?
Oh, of course, I was worried because having seen China's successful mediation in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia, they definitely are afraid that another similar success might be made, and that will reduce Americans' credibility or reputation considerably. So I do not believe they just want to see, a ceasefire at all, because that is certainly not in their own interest. So they start to pick problems with China's peace plan, to say that it has no roadmap and so forth. Right now, there is a grain of truth in that China's peace plan is more on general principles rather than a roadmap. But there are two aspects of the same thing. First of all, to find a roadmap, you need some principles, and these principles will guide you, right, in finding the roadmap. The second thing is, if no parties wants a ceasefire, be it Russia or Ukraine or even the United States, how can any other countries help in finding the roadmap, right? So unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, we're going to see people continue to die because we do not know how long it will take for them to reach a ceasefire. But before that, people will simply die. We have to see more casualties. This is most unfortunate.
Well, Glenn, of course, because the war is ongoing in the European continent, it seems like at least some European countries, they have different views from Washington. They genuinely wants to see peace, wants to see a political, diplomatic settlement for the crisis. In that sense, their interest, I would say, is actually, part of the Chinese consideration, because for China, the priority, peace serves the interests of every country, and the stability the same in that region. Do you think the European countries see the Chinese visit the same as in Washington?
Well, it depends. There's a huge difference between the European countries. Countries such as Hungary has taken a clear stance that they do not want to fuel this proxy war, so they don't want to send weapons. Other countries like Poland, they seem almost ready to go to war themselves. But I think there's a lot of countries who, like Austria, who's now taking a second look at this, because when we were going against the Russians on this one, sending weapons, trying to destroy its economy, we were kind of sold the idea that Russia would collapse, its economy would collapse before the weekend. It could be defeated on the battlefield. This is what, again, the top EU foreign policy chief said. Again, not much of a diplomatic argument, but he said that we would defeat Russia on the battlefield, would crush their economy, would isolate them in the world. But now that 1 year into this, Russia's economy is doing better than the German and the British economy. Its military is winning on the battlefield, effectively not just defeating Ukraine, but the entirety of NATO, which we've pumped in or emptied all our weapon storages. And also Russia isn't really isolated in the world, as this meeting with Xi Jinping obviously demonstrates. But even beyond this, outside NATO, the vast majority of the world, like 85 to 90% of the world's population, are living in countries who do not want to be a part of this, who's not sending weapons, who are not putting sanctions. So we failed by all measures, and our economies are struggling. We're having enduring war on the continent. So there's more and more apprehension. So you're seeing protests taking place. You're seeing more political leaders speaking out whether or not this has been a good idea. So, and also now that we're dependent on American energy, they're selling it very expensive. They're giving these huge subsidies programs in the US, which is luring European companies who can't survive in Europe. Now they're going over to the United States. So there's many who are feeling a little bit taken advantage of. If you also factor in the United States attacking the Nord Stream pipeline of Germany, I think many Europeans want to take a second look who actually are our allies. And is this China on the other side? Are they really as evil as Washington wants us to believe, or do they actually have good economic partnerships? Are they promoting peace? And so I think a lot has changed over the past year, and for this reason, you see the consensus within the EU as well as NATO is not as strong as they would like, as they're projecting, as they would like us to think.
Well, Andrew, back to you. Focusing on the bilateral relationship, in particular, if you look at the trade between China and Russia, for example, over the previous 2 months, January and February, we see there's increase of 20% of Chinese exports to Russia. Tell us more. What's the future prospect of the bilateral trade?
I believe that when it comes to bilateral trade, there really are no limits. Of course, the primary focus for the short term is going to be on hydrocarbons. This is mutually beneficial because Russia has an excess that it cannot sell to Western partners, whereas China has a need to continue purchasing as much as possible to get its economy back on track and continue growing, which is very important. Secondly, of course, we have the fourth industrial revolution, everything from chips to AI to 5G to the Internet of Things. This is definitely going to be the next phase of the economic dimension of the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership. Then there are logistics. China and the EU, despite having some issues with one another, are still very important trade partners. And in order to facilitate trade, since it's politically unviable to go through the Eurasian land bridge through Russia because of the EU's anti-Russian sanctions, it doesn't mean that there isn't trade going through, but just that the potential has been capped, at least for the indefinite future. The Northern Sea route through the Arctic Ocean is going to become a lot more important. And it's here where Russia and China can cooperate on developing related infrastructure. Also, I'd like to say that when it comes to the overall aspect of Russian-Chinese trade, as was earlier touched upon, the use of national currencies is of supreme importance. And especially if they were able to multilateralize the use of national currencies, not just in terms of their bilateral trade, but let's look at the larger scenario that seems to be emerging. Just recently, Beijing brokered the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, which has been talked about earlier in this segment. However, what I think is the most important aspect of that isn't just that China was able to bring two previously fierce rivals together, but if you look at those two countries' energy importance, I mean, Iran is a gas superpower. Saudi Arabia is an oil superpower. And if you look at Russia, which is very close to all three of them, it's an oil and a gas superpower. And China is consuming those resources. If they all started using national currencies, well, the petrodollar, upon which the American hegemony is largely predicated, would be dealt a death blow whenever that happens. It's still some time coming, but I think it's something we should keep an eye on, and it would serve everybody's interests, not just Russia and China, but the entire emerging multipolar world orders.
Well, shifting to the Chinese diplomacy, Zhou Bo, you once mentioned recently that China is entering the sea, basically beginning, let's say, with the Chinese efforts to achieve the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now is focusing on more or less on the Ukraine crisis. Tell us more about that. Zhou Bo?
Well, yeah. This mediation in the Middle East, of course, is a resounding success. But then the implication is how could China possibly make a breakthrough, for example, in the Ukrainian issue? And because of China's success in the Middle East, it is natural people might have such expectations. But as I said before, first of all, this is a bilateral issue. Whether these two countries would like to come to a stop, it really depends. Or maybe the best moment for other countries to help is when these two countries, for the different reasons, may not want to continue fighting, or they are really fatigued finally. So that is the moment when other countries can actually help. China's peace plan is a kind of a generous offer, but there's no guarantees that it will succeed because there could be any other peace plans. For example, even in the beginning, there was such a plan coming from Italy. So there are actually more than one peace plans, and these two countries may decide themselves to find a way out. But we would be most happy if they can find a way out.
Yeah, we got to be pragmatic. Yeah. With that, we conclude today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinzhuo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.